let's prepare our model for export over into Maya so that we can begin retopologizing our little sculpture here. Now, luckily for us, working with the input-output system in Blender is really easy. However, there's some housekeeping things that we need to do on the model before we go any further. And these are things that you definitely want to double check to ensure that what you export is going to be imported cleanly and correctly inside of Maya. So let's do some examinations of the objects themselves. Now, first and foremost, I'm in object mode. This is my my concept sculpture that I just completed. So with that object selected, the first thing that I need to examine are my object transforms. And specifically, what I'm looking at here is that I need to look at all of my transform channels. These transform channels need to be applied. So we should see a value or location values of zeros, a rotation values of zeros, and scale to 1.0. Now, if yours is something different, it's really easy to fix this. Just make sure that the object's selected and go into the object pull-down menu, apply, and specifically what you're after here, let me see if I can get out of the way, is apply all transforms. And that's going to take its current location, its current rotation, and its current scale values and set them to 0 degrees, and a value of 1.0. Let me do that real fast. I'm going to apply all of my transforms, and I'm ready to rock and roll. Now, the other thing that you should do, and should already be done, is that you should ensure that your object is sitting right here at the origin of your scene itself. This is super important. The origin is a defined location inside of all 3D modeling applications. It doesn't matter if you're working in Maya, Modo, Cinema 4D, ZBrush. The origin is the only known location. So it's super critical that our model be placed at the origin of the scene. As a reminder, the intersection of all three of our axes is the origin. So right there, that's the origin. So I want to have my model centered around the origin of the scene itself. Now, you're more than welcome and encouraged to do this by hand, but also keep in mind that we can also do this using the origin point and the 3D cursor. If yours is not, if you need to position your object a little bit more carefully inside of your three-dimensional scene, you can use both the 3D cursor and the origin point to get your geometry where it needs to go. Now, if you don't see your 3D cursor, it's okay. Oftentimes, the visibility of our cursor has been disabled. If you go into your viewport properties, you can turn the visibility of your 3D cursor on right there. And mine's way offset. If you look carefully here, and I know it's hard to see, mine's away from the origin of the scene. It's at some weird location inside of the environment. And that's okay, because we can always go back and return the origin to where we want it to go pretty easily. Okay, let's go ahead and do it real fast. If you go to the object pull-down menu, we have set origin, and we have a couple different options here. Check it out. We have geometry to origin, interesting, origin to geometry, origin to 3D cursor, and then origin to center of mass, and then the center of mass volume. But there's no cursor to center of scene. So how do we get the cursor back to where we want it to go? Well, luckily it's really easy. Here's the keyboard shortcut. Hit the N key, N as in November. It's going to slide out a cool little shelf, of which down here in the View tab, we have the ability to change and reset the location of our 3D cursor. So we just put zeros in here. There we go. Voila. And now our 3D cursor is right back where we want it to go. Hit the N key again to slide that shelf out of the way. And now we have both the origin and our cursor at the center of the scene. So if your model is offset, you have some options now. Because now you can go to set origin and you can go to geometry to origin. And remember, that little orange dot is the origin point for this object. So if the origin points is at the origin of our scene, you're good to go. Or you could do origin to 3D cursor if it's not, okay? But point being is that you need to get your geometry and your cursor and your origin point for this object at the origin of the scene. I think I just said origin like 8 times in a row, so I apologize if that's confusing. Because remember, we have the scene level origin point, which is 0, 0, 0 on all 3 of our global axes. And then each object has its own local origin. We need to sync all of this up. We need to get the object's origin point to the origin of the scene. And then we need to get the object's geometry to the origin of our scene as well. And luckily, this set origin pull-down menu gives you all of the options that you need to facilitate that little dance that we played. Okay, so we have all of our transforms applied. Our geometry and our origin point for this object is set to the origin point in the scene. We're ready to go. Now we have two different options to export our data into. The first one is probably the most robust one, and I bring this to the surface because it's probably the most used file format out there, and it's called the Fbx File Format. We can find it, and I apologize. Now let's select all the objects that we want to be exported. I'm going to grab my bear and its eyes. And then we can find the export functions in the file menu. And Fbx, it's kind of like 3/4 of the way down. Let me see if I can lean out of the way. It's right there inside of our three-dimensional, our scene, our interface. Now we have some choices in here. This is going to bring open the file browser of your computer. So you need to be very aware where you're saving your scene. I'm going to save mine just to the folder that contains all the project files for this project. And I want you to spend some time really looking over the details that you find over here on the right side of this part of the interface. All of this jazz. Because there's some important things in here. The Fbx file format is the most robust file format that we have. It's going to include a lot of information, including all of your scene cameras, your lights, references to textures, the materials, basically everything that's been used to comprise and to communicate the details of this scene are going to be packaged up and saved inside that file format. Now at times we want all of that information, especially when we're exchanging data from one app to another. But there are other times when we don't need our lights and our cameras. This is a great example and a great opportunity to strip out some of this extra stuff. Like I don't need my camera. I only want my mesh information. I'm just sending this over to Maya so they can retopologize it, right? I don't need all of this other mumbo jumbo in here. I just need my mesh. So we get to customize our export properties to ensure that we're only exporting the data that we want from Blender. Now the other thing that I like to do is do selected objects and limit, because that's just going to export the selected objects inside the scene. If this is off, it's just going to take everything that's in your outliner and send it over into Maya, which may not be the result that you're looking for. Also, one final thing down here at the bottom, I want you to pay real close attention to the transform information. The scale, we may want to adjust this. Sometimes if you've modeled your creature really tiny in Blender, it's going to come in microscopic over in Maya. Having a global scale adjustment value here could make this file a little bit easier to work with over inside of Maya. Now the other thing that I want you to be very mindful, and these are things that you probably don't necessarily need to change, but they're good things to double check, is the forward and up. Remember, here in Blender, our Z-axis represents the vertical axis. Over in Maya, it's the Y-axis that represents up and down. So you want to make sure that under this up value, it says Y up. That's super important. Blender is one of the few 3D modeling applications that works in a Z up environment. So we got to make sure that when we're exporting it, it's going to rotate the model for us, which is very cool. I like this. In addition, the forward orientation of our object needs to be -Z, which is precisely what we're looking for. So these should be the defaults inside of your Fbx export properties, but double check them. Now the other things that I like to make sure that I just look at before I hit the big export button is this animation stuff. Now this object doesn't have any animation in it, so I want to uncheck bake animation. With this on, it's actually going to put a keyframe on every single frame inside of our sequence setting, which we don't want, right? We just want to have the geometry, which in turn is going to make this file a little bit easier to use, smaller in file size, and a little bit more understood when we get over inside of Maya. There's not all these crazy like bells and whistles and extra things that are clouding our understanding as to if this model imported correctly over into Maya. So I'm pretty happy with the results that I see here. I'm just going to leave it the same name as my project file. That's a great little tip. Keeping the integrity of our naming conventions intact makes it really easy to make a visual and cognitive connection between your Blender file and the Fbx file. If they're both named the exact same thing, you're going to think, oh, these are the exact same thing, right? So I always leave mine named the same, so I have that cognitive connection between them. All right, once you hit export FBX, it's going to save the file to the location that you've determined right here instead of your Blender Finder. It's a pretty easy system and a pretty extensible system. So that's how you set up your project file to export out an FBX file inside of Blender. As I mentioned before, there's actually 2 files that we can export. From time to time, the FBX doesn't work or can produce a lot of problems. So we have one other alternative, and it's the object file. The object file is kind of the old guard, if you will, of the 3D modeling industry. We find let me select my objects again, excuse me. Under the Export pull-down menu, Wavefront OBJ is the name of the file that we're looking for, and I apologize. Let me get out of the way. It's second from the bottom. Wavefront object file. And you're going to get some very similar properties in here. The object file is the oldest 3D file format in our business. It's one of the original formats from the 80s, quite literally. And so it's a really basic, simple 3D representation. It's a 3D surface file, right? It doesn't have all the bells and whistles that you see in the Fbx file format. Simply, it's just your geometry. Okay, so it's not going to include your cameras, your lights, references to textures. It's a pretty simple world. So this is kind of my fail-safe. If my Fbx file format doesn't work or is producing a lot of headaches, I'm just going to come back over, pop out an OBJ file, and I'm up and running on the way. Take a good hard look at the transform export properties. Same thing kind of goes. Just make sure that Z forward and Y up is selected in here. You don't want to have animation, so make sure you uncheck that, and you're good to go. Make sure you're naming it something that you're going to be able to understand, and it's going to work with inside of your own production pipeline. And in addition, please make sure you're managing your media and being aware as to where on your computer you're saving all these files. So the Fbx file format and the object file are the 2 file formats that are going to make importing into Maya a breeze. And with both of these file formats in tow, we can begin our retopologizing.